Hi, everyone. I'm here with Nowlin-Sohl, who is a senior staff attorney with the National ACLU's LGBTQ and HIV project. And Lee also, happily, is a former QLaw Foundation board member, so longtime friend of the QLaw. And I'm Denise Diskin. I'm one of QLaw Foundation's volunteers and worked with the organization for a while, so you've seen my face before probably. And we are here because Lee is one of the attorneys on the Orr versus Trump case regarding passports. And so since the February 5th video that QLaw Foundation did, giving lots of information about passports, travel, and other pro tips, many things have changed about passports. And Lee and other really amazing attorneys have been working in the courts to make sure that trans folks have all of the rights you deserve and are entitled to. So if you haven't seen that first video, there's lots in there, including travel tips, Washington state IDs, and database information. And it's worth a watch on the QLaw Foundation YouTube page. But for now, let's dive into what has changed. So Lee, in the QLaw Foundation's last video, which was February 5th, the Trump administration had just issued its terrible executive order about passports, but we know that there's been several court challenges since then. Where do things stand today?
Yeah, thanks, Denise. So fortunately, a district court in Massachusetts has preliminarily enjoined the executive order and the State Department's kind of memos implementing that executive order. What that means is the court has kind of paused that new policy, and the old policy is still in place for people who kind of fit within the class. The court also certified the class action, which means that everyone who fits within the definition of the class is covered by this litigation. You don't have to do anything to benefit from the preliminary injunction. What that means is people can apply to get their passports with correct sex markers on them. And so there's kind of four different elements to know if you're part of the class. So the first one is if you don't have a current valid passport, you can apply for one with the correct sex designation on it. If you need to renew your passport because it expires within 1 year, you can also renew that now. If your passport has a longer kind of validity to it, so you're not able to renew at this time. If you need to change your passport, so for example, if your passport has an incorrect sex designation on it, or if you need to kind of just update your name, even if you have the correct sex designation, you can make those changes and still get the correct sex designation. And the fourth category of folks are those who've, lost their passport or it's been damaged. They can replace it with the correct sex marker. And so what you need to do is go to the State Department website. There's instructions there on how to apply, and you'll have to submit an attestation. Woo, that word caught me up. An attestation form that says that you are part of the class. And it's a pretty straightforward form. It lays out kind of all the categories that I just listed, and you have to check a box that says, which marker that you want and sign saying that you are covered as part of the class. The other kind of update is that, unsurprisingly, the State Department and the government has appealed this preliminary injunction. It's on appeal currently before the First Circuit. They've also asked the First Circuit to stay the preliminary injunction, so kind of pause the pause in a way. So at this time, we don't think that there's good reasons for the court to pause the preliminary injunction, but there is a risk that they might. So, that could happen at any day. So there is some fragility to the PI. If the stay is denied, they could appeal that to the Supreme Court as well. If the Supreme Court were to deny the stay, then the preliminary injunction would be in place for the entire life of the litigation until we get a final judgment from the court.
Got it. Okay, so to kind of unpack that a little bit, it sounds like what you're saying is that right now, the preliminary injunction has prevented the Trump administration from changing the rule about passports. And we're not sure how long that's going to last because it's going to get appealed. And that's always an uncertainty, where how those appeals are going to come out. So if folks are applying who have never had a passport, are renewing a passport that will expire within a year, need their passport changed because their current passport is wrong, or lost their passport or it was stolen. I knew I was going to get the fourth one. If you're in one of those four groups, then you can just do your passport form on the State Department website like you would normally, but include that attestation form. Did I get all that right?
You got it all right with one clarification. There are some limitations about the ability to apply online. So I would recommend going to the State Department website. You may need to either mail it in or even potentially go in person. But yes, you can otherwise submit the forms as you normally would, along with that attestation form. If for some reason you forget the attestation form or something else, and State Department realizes that you might be a member of the class, they'll reach out to you and ask for that form, but it could delay you getting the passport.
Got it. Got it. And is that attestation form on the State Department website along with the application materials? I know I've seen it on the ACLU's website, which, pro tip for those watching, is very helpful about all of these updates. But is it also on the State Department's website?
It is on the State Department's website. It's not on, I think, kind of their main passport application page, but if you search, I think, sex markers and passports, they have a page dedicated to that, and there is a link to the form there.
Got it. Got it. Wonderful. Well, that's really helpful because I know what I've been hearing from our communities in, talking to folks in legal clinic appointments and talking to folks since our last video is that folks are really worried about, either they didn't make that window before inauguration day to get their passport change in, or they sent it in, but then the government sent them back a passport with the wrong marker. And so I know a lot of those folks have been feeling a little bit in limbo of like, what do I do now? And so this is really helpful. It sounds like folks in that position would, probably qualify because they have a passport that's wrong, and they could apply for that change now in this window.
Yes, and there's a form, it's called the DS-5504, and that allows you to kind of correct an error that was made on your passport, like a printing error, such as your name or your sex marker. And so if you received a passport kind of since January that has the sex marker that you did not request, you can submit that DS-5504, and there's not an application fee with that. And so if you fall kind of within that category, I'd highly recommend using that form. Again, the State Department website kind of lays out which forms you might need to use, whether for a new application, a renewal, or correction, but that's a really good option for people who did receive an incorrect passport.
Great. That is really good information, because I know a lot of folks have been pretty salty about that application fee, rightly so.
Yes.
And so, what about situations where folks submitted for a new passport but haven't heard back yet? I know, one question I've gotten is like, what if I submit for my passport and the rule changes again?
Yeah, and that's a great question, and one that I don't necessarily know the answer to. So, what we saw happen right after the executive court order came out is that the State Department kind of just paused the processing of applications while they figured out what they were going to do. Our understanding is that that has resumed. Applications are being processed. We're hearing from a lot of folks who are getting passports with accurate sex designations on them. So the preliminary injunction is working. It is being complied with to the best of our knowledge. If your passport has been kind of delayed for some reason for an unreasonably long period of time, I would recommend kind of reaching out to the State Department and looking into it, because that might be a problem beyond kind of the scope of this issue. If the preliminary injunction were to be lifted, we don't know what would happen. It's possible that they would pause processing again. It's possible that they would resume issuing incorrect sex designations to people. So, we don't know. And, for people who are looking at applying, in the near future, it would be one consideration and one reason to maybe consider expediting your application, because it's not really necessarily when the application is submitted that's going to be the determinative factor. It's really when you have that passport in hand. And that's what we saw with the executive order, right? Plenty of people had applied prior to the executive order and still got passports with incorrect markers. So to the extent that you're considering applying, I think the sooner the better.
Right. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. And is another good reason to get it in, right? Because if it's sitting on somebody's desk in the State Department and then the rule changes, you might end up stuck. That makes sense. Um, so is there, we talked a minute ago about the, using the, is it D5504?
The DS 5504, yes.
Oh, so close. I bet you never thought that you would know so many government forms by name and number, right? It's
It's
just like a
true.
level of knowledge that no one ever wanted. Um, but I have, and that's the form that you can use to correct a passport that you've gotten since Inauguration Day, and that allows you to waive the application fee. Is there any avenue available to get reimbursed for fees that folks already paid when they got their passport with the wrong marker on it?
Unfortunately, not that I am aware of. So, to the extent that people paid a fee, they would have to pay that fee regardless. And so if they're able to correct it for free, hopefully the kind of the end sum is the same. That's not necessarily true for like the postal fees of submitting these materials. And I realize that that is burdensome, and unfair. And unfortunately, at this time, there's not kind of an avenue to seek reimbursement for that we're aware of.
Yeah, it's always worth asking, right?
Yes.
Um, so one question that I've heard folks ask a lot is about data alignment, right? Where because a lot of folks don't have aligned data across different government IDs, and particularly with federal identifiers, specifically like Social Security records and passport records. Do those your Social Security records and your passport records need to have consistent gender markers in order to get the gender marker that you need on your passport?
So my understanding is that that has not been a requirement in the past. Um, and I'm aware of anything that would make it so now, other than the executive order. But the executive order has been stayed by the court as it applies to passports. So the executive order still applies to Social Security. So our understanding is that people are not able to change their sex designation with Social Security, but are with passports. And so to the extent that that may result in kind of different markers with those agencies, that is not a problem. That is permitted by the preliminary injunction at this time.
Got it. That's great news. Um, so one question I've heard people asking is that, obviously there's court orders and executive orders, and you might go to your local passport office and interact with a human, right? Who maybe is not up to date, or maybe is someone who has their own agenda in the way that they do their job. A lot of folks that I've been talking to are really worried about their passport applications getting rejected at the local office. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about the legality of that, and if there's any avenue that someone might pursue if that happens to them.
Yeah, so we're not hearing of people getting passports applications rejected for kind of gender marker purposes. What we're hearing about is people getting passports issued with incorrect
Mhm.
gender markers. And so, you may still get issued a passport with the wrong marker, but you shouldn't be rejected. And if you are, it may be for reasons kind of separate from this. Um, if you are issued a passport with the wrong sex designation or gender marker, and you followed all the steps, submitted the attestation form, we ask that you would actually reach out to us. So the ACLU has an FAQ webpage. You can Google it, or it's also going to be available along with this video. And there's a link there to submit an intake. And we are tracking those, and we can be in touch with you about options for how to fix that. Because that should not be happening.
Great. That's really helpful to know. And I know that folks are really worried about that you know, the moment of like that interpersonal interaction and experiencing discrimination. So it's good to know. And it also sounds like folks should be really, really conscientious that this is not a form that, you know, when you're filling out your passport forms, you want to make sure that all of your other sort of I's are dotted and T's are crossed so that you don't accidentally get your passport bounced for some non-gender marker related reason.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
that's good to know. Um, I know folks are also sometimes worried about having to, like when you do a passport change through the mail, they often ask that you send in your documentation and your old passport in order for the government to make the change. And do you have uh, any recommendations for folks who might be concerned about being left with no documents?
Yeah, I mean that is a tricky thing to navigate, right? And to time it correctly to,
Mm,
align with your travel and life needs. Um, again, consider expediting if that's something that you need and can afford. I looked it up earlier. I think the processing time right now for passports, the routine processing time is 4 to 6 weeks. Expedited is 2 to 3 weeks. If you're traveling within 14 days, you can also kind of go in person and have that happen even more quickly, often same day or within a day or two. But yes, I understand the concern around kind of submitting those documents and your current passport. I'm not aware of a way to kind of avoid that. Um, and that is just kind of how the process works for everybody and is a bit of a risk.
mm.
So, each person will need to evaluate that based on their own comfort level and needs.
Yeah. Yeah, it's certainly a good idea to photocopy everything that you send in so that you have at least documentation that you of what you had, right, when you sent it in.
Yes.
Because I know folks sort of go to the worst case scenario of things getting lost in the mail or, you know, there's lots of worst case scenarios we can play out, but that you know, the vast majority of the time people do get their documents, you know, in an appropriate timeline. And it's just really like, what's the peace of mind that you need? And here I'll also just interject that, you know, depending on where your travel is, you know, you may also, if you have a Washington enhanced driver's license that doesn't rely on any sort of um, federal designation, you can put MF or X on that document using Washington state rules and travel to at least to Canada and Mexico. Um,
Mhm.
and so, and, you know, and travel by air um, domestically because of the new Real ID requirements. Um, so that's helpful. And I'm throwing you a little bit of a curveball because we didn't prepare for this one. Do you happen to know um, if you have to show travel plans in order to get a passport in 14 days or less?
My understanding is that you usually do, and I don't know if you have to show them or say that you like kind of explain what they are. I don't know what the level of proof is, but yes, you do usually have to have plans of some kind within 14 days.
Right. Okay. Well, it's a great time to visit our long lost Aunt Gertrude in Australia.
We're just our northern neighbors in Canada for those
That's
in
right.
Washington
Or
watching.
that. That's probably easier. Great. So, is now that the administration has been in place for a few months, sort of speaking to that Canada piece, has anything changed in what you've been seeing about the safety of border crossings? And are there any changes to the recommendations for how to keep ourselves, or particularly, I know folks are worried about their kids when their kids are trans. Do you have
Mhm.
any thoughts or any observations about whether any of those factors have shifted?
Yeah, so, at this time, I have not heard of anybody having problems at the border because of the sex designation on their identity documents. The State Department website is very clear that they are still, respecting passports that have been issued with, like with sex designations inconsistent with the executive order. So, and that includes X markers. So we have not heard problems around that. Some kind of practical thoughts for people to kind of keep themselves safe and be, extra cautious If you have a real ID, I would recommend bringing that with you. Have backup identification with you when you travel. If you've had your name changed via court order, you might want to bring a copy of that document, things like that. So have kind of backup documentation when you travel. If you are traveling to other countries, you might want to look up in advance kind of what their policies are, whether they, accept passports with X designations. My understanding is that, via kind of international code requirements that they are required to, but it's best to know what you're heading into and what their policies are as well.
That's really helpful information. And then also, just as a former adoption attorney, I'll say if you're traveling with a child that you have adopted, either through second parent adoption or third parent adoption, or any other adoption mechanism, you want to make sure you bring your adoption decree with you, to make sure that you can clarify any questions about your parental status at the border, because that I know can be really, again, not something that we have heard folks reporting issues with, but I always say those are documents you get for the worst day of your life, not the best day of your life.
Right.
So,
Right.
great. Did I miss anything, Lee? Anything else you want to add?
I don't think so. Yeah, I would just, encourage people to go get your accurate passports if that's what you need, and make the decisions that are best for you. We'll continue to keep you updated on the litigation and the preliminary injunction as it continues to proceed.
Great. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it, Lee, that you are doing this work. Y'all, it was so fun to see like Lee being a total baddie in these court hearings. And thanks to everyone for listening. If you want to make sure that QLaw Foundation can continue to keep our Washington communities updated about all of the changes coming at us, please visit QLawFoundation.org and make a donation. Like many organizations, QLaw Foundation has had to work extra hard to make ends meet right now, right as you all need information most. So it's a perfect storm. So if you feel like you benefited from the information we provided today, please be sure to go to QLawFoundation.org and make a donation that feels meaningful to you. And also peep QLaw Foundation's Falltacular celebration coming up at the end of September and get your tickets. So if you are in the Seattle area or want to come visit us from another place, QLaw Foundation throws a heck of a party.
It's
Thanks,
one of the best
everyone.
events of the year.
One of the best events of the year. That's right. It'll be fun. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.